Now that we have a better idea of how to expose a photo, we'll need to get out there and take some. Some of the best photos taken are either candid, spontaneous or planned. That's because we either get a really natural photo, we capture a fleeting moment, or we wait for the perfect conditions. Looking for an interesting subject and being able to compose the shot well is an art. If you experiment enough, you'll begin to develop an eye for a good shot. So it's really important to critically review your photos and understand what works well and what doesn't. In this section, we break down the thought process into 4 key elements: subject, composition, exposure, and technical. Essentially, this section could be used as a checklist or a method to getting a better shot. Here I'm only providing a précis of each topic, as each is a vast subject in its own right. So what separates a good photo from a bad one? Well, I've entered enough competitions to know that it's actually very subjective. I also have a Flickr account which has around 1,000 photos on it. The pictures that have attracted the most attention are not always the ones I consider to be my best. Nevertheless, a great photo starts with a vision. As I said earlier, one developed an eye for a photograph, but here are a few considerations. Subject, focal point, story, texture, patterns, mood, and memory. If you can get one or more of the above in your mind, you're off to a good start. The top picture was all about textures and patterns, and it has a focal point. The bottom photo, for me, was a memory, but to others, there's a clear subject and a story behind it. You can improve the odds of taking a good photo with planning. For example, if I were taking a colourful photograph of the shoreline, I need to know when the sunset coincides with low water. The photograph at the beginning of this section was all about weather over a dramatic landscape. Taking the picture of an inside of a washing machine was all about lighting. And action shots are all about capturing the moment. Composition is possibly the most complicated aspect of photography. If we have a subject and we just set our camera to auto, we'll get a shot. But composing a good photo is an art. This can be broken down into the following. Viewpoint. Do we need to stand closer or further away from our subject? The top picture is all about the lines in a beautiful old car. If I wanted a picture of the car, I'd clearly have to stand back. We've all seen terrible pictures of groups of people with the shot cut off at the knees. It's neither a headshot or a full body shot. If you take a picture of your pet, get down at eye level, it really improves the shot. A step to the right or the left can remove the clutter from the edges of your frame. Most pictures of a distant horizon look two-dimensional or flat. Try putting something in the foreground to give the picture depth. As we've already discovered in the section on lenses, focal length plays a key role in setting our perspective. If you want the background to feature heavily in the shot, use a longer focal length. It compresses the scene. The horizontal orientation that we generally hold our camera in is called landscape. If we hold it vertically, it's called portrait. Panoramas are a great way to fit everything in if your lens can't capture the whole scene in one hit. Cropping a photo can really enhance it. For example, you can cut out unwanted clutter from the edges, trim off a bit too much sky, or simply zoom in on the subject. Why not give it a try with some of your old photos? And finally, we come to framing, which sits at the heart of composition. The rule of thirds is simply a 1/3 grid placed over your photo where your key elements in your photo line up with. For example, the photo at the bottom of the page has its horizon on the top third. On most cameras, you can overlay the back of the screen with this grid. If you can't display this in camera, you can find it in the crop tool in software. The rule of thirds is not limited to lines. Putting an eye, for example, on one of the intersections of the thirds also works well. Leading lines help guide the eye through the picture. The lines don't have to be straight. A meandering path in the shape of an S or a curve look great too. Both of these pictures have leading lines. Space for direction. This is all about leaving more space in front of the subject than behind. For example, if you have a side profile of a face, give it a bit more space for the eyes to look into. Or if you have a moving object, leave a bit of space in front of it. Balance is a difficult one to describe, but basically if you look at a photo and all the interest is on one side, you need something to counterweigh it. In the photo at the bottom, the image would be less balanced if the breakwater on the far right hand side was missing, even though it's tiny. Symmetry. Lines and shapes often look better on a photo if they are symmetrical. These are just some of the guidelines to framing, and there are more if you dive into the subject. Like all rules, they are there to be broken, but my advice is to master them first. We've already learnt the basics of exposure, and we know that our cameras can help us in this quest. We also know that we can compensate our exposure to get a darker or lighter frame than the camera suggests. If you're shooting a moving scene, then shutter speed is key. When shooting, we need to decide whether shutter speed or aperture are the most important factors in the shot. Equally, if you're trying to get slow motion, as seen in the water on the right hand side, you want a slow shutter speed. If that's the case, you need a tripod. Now that we've selected our focal length, aperture is all about depth of field. If you want a deep depth of field, then your shutter speed will need to come down unless you're planning to up the ISO. As we increase ISO, we get more noise and less dynamic range. For this reason, I try to keep ISO as low as possible, and it's the last factor I adjust. However, there are situations where it needs to be increased. For example, if I'm using a long lens to capture a moving animal, here I need a really fast shutter speed, but if I'm already at my widest aperture, then I need to up my ISO to get the exposure. Another good example would be trying to capture a scene in low light. Finally, if I have a lot of contrast in the scene, then there's a likelihood that the camera doesn't have sufficient dynamic range to capture the highlights and the lowlights without blowing out. This typically occurs when the sun's in the frame. In this case, you need to bracket the exposures. If you want to do this in an automatic mode, put the camera on a tripod, set the camera to aperture priority, set up the brackets, put the self timer on 2 seconds, and press the shutter and let the camera take 3 shots automatically. You can then merge the photos when you get home to your computer. So far, we've decided on a subject, we've composed the frame, and we've set the exposure. It's now time to focus. Autofocus or manual focus. As we all know, modern cameras are really quick to focus, so for the majority of shots they are really fantastic. But there are occasions where autofocus falls apart completely. A prime example is astrophotography, where they cannot see infinity in the dark. If you want to focus on the Milky Way, then you need to do it by hand. Another situation where autofocus falls down is in panoramic photography, where the camera can easily change focus between the shots. As a rule, if you're using a camera that has contrast autofocus, try helping it by placing the focus over an edge. This will provide the contrast it's looking for. Focusing on a blank sheet of paper is a tall order for a camera. Single point or multiple point focus. If that's the subject's nose and you want to focus on their eyes, it's out. Cameras tend to find the closest point in the focal point array that you're using as their go-to point. Multiple point focusing is not infallible, and I'm sure you've all taken photos where the camera's autofocus has concentrated on the wrong point. The beauty of single point focus is that you get to dictate what to focus on. However, this takes time and you don't always have time. Single shot or continuous focus. If your subject is moving, use continuous autofocus. If it's static, use single shot. The latest cameras have incredible focusing capabilities. They can keep up with a moving target while shooting at 20 frames per second. Even dated digital SLRs have artificial intelligence built into their autofocus systems. What do you want in focus? Once we've chosen our focal length and aperture, depth of field is controlled by focus distance. The nearer the focus, the shallower the depth of field, and the further the focus, the deeper the depth of field. But remember the fact that 2/3 of the depth of field is behind the focus point. So we would be wasting our depth of field by focusing on the horizon. To explain this a bit better, I'm going to talk through the process of focusing the photo on the right hand side. Where to focus? If I focused on the foreground rocks, the depth of field would be shallow. If I focus on the background, the depth of field would be larger, but the foreground is unlikely to be in focus. So I would focus on the rock in the middle. In distance terms, this is about 1/3 of the way into the frame. In this situation, I would use single point focus. That way, I know the camera is focusing exactly where I want it to be. In summary, if we are taking a portrait, then the eyes are the point to focus on. If we are taking a scene with a deep depth of field, we focus 1/3 of the way into the scene. If we want to be technical, we could look up the hyperfocal distance, which was mentioned earlier. In cases where you can't achieve sufficient depth of field, you need to focus stack. This was also covered earlier. We're almost ready to take the shot, but there are a few other technical things that we need to think about. If you're out in the landscape, it's not uncommon for there to be fairly dramatic changes in the light. If the sun gets obscured by a cloud, your exposure will need to change. Equally, if you're shooting at sunrise or sunset, the light changes very quickly. There's nothing worse than taking a great shot only to discover that you've captured something around the edges or in the background that you really don't want. Not so long ago, photographers used to go out into the field with a stack of filters to try to get the exposure right in camera. These are broken down into 3 categories: neutral density filters, circular polarizing filters, and graduated filters. A neutral density filter is a sheet of grey tinted glass that can be placed in front of the lens to reduce the amount of light coming into the camera. They come in various tints and are rated in stops from 1 to 10, where a 1 stop is a slight tint and a 10 stop ND is like looking through a welder's mask. For example, a 6 stop ND filter cuts out 6 stops of light. This enables the photographer to slow down the shutter speed drastically. These are typically used to blur water. If my original shutter speed was a 60th of a second, I would need to adjust my shutter speed to 1 second to get the same exposure. Circular polarizing filters control the direction that light enters your lens. They can be handy to cut down glare or reflections, and they generally make colours appear more saturated. But they can't really be used when facing the sun. Graduated filters are like neutral density filters, but only half the filter. The other half is clear. These are generally used to tone down a bright sky. However, they have lost popularity since the advent of exposure bracketing. Keeping the camera steady for the duration of the exposure is key to getting a crisp image. If you venture lower than the minimum shutter speed, you're going to need a tripod. When using a tripod, you need to turn the image stabilization off, or it will keep working and it may blur the picture. We now come to our final checks. A couple of good quality lens cloths is a must. I've been in many situations on the coast, close to waterfalls and in the rain where the lens gets wet. And on a cold night it doesn't take long for the lens to fog up. It's also handy to have a dust blower for everyday use. If your camera shoots raw images, make sure it's your chosen output. The files are bigger, but the benefits will become immediately apparent when it comes to editing. We've already talked about flare and the benefits of using a lens hood. If you're still getting flare, you need to shield the front element by casting a shadow over the lens. Over time, a sensor will pick up dust. This is usually caused when you change lenses, so face the camera down and change the lens as quickly as possible. If you get a few dust spots on your sensor, you can correct this in software, but there comes a time when your sensor needs a clean. Sending your camera away to be professionally cleaned is not cheap. However, you can buy sensor cleaning kits off the web for far less. Now that we've taken the shot, it's time to review it. Don't leave it till later. Zoom into the shot and check the focus on the screen. View the histogram on the back of your camera to check it's not blown. You cannot recover from an out of focus or blown image.